Hello and welcome to Lard TV and the first in a series of walkthrough programs for Infamy. What we want to do with this series is to produce a number of short programs, each covering a certain aspect of the rules. In that way we can walk and talk you through each section a step at a time. Now today we're going to start with deployment. In the next one we'll be covering movement and so on right the way through the rules. When that's done we'll be bringing you some full games so you can see the whole thing tied together in action. But let's start at the very beginning and see where we can deploy from. It's a tiny one-page slice of the book, but it's very important because it covers issues such as not just deployment but also ambushing, which is a key part of the game, especially if you are a barbarian character. Now we have three options here. We've got the deployment zone, ambush points and the deployment points. The deployment zone is on the player's table edge and it's 24 inches wide and 6 inches deep. So effectively a large rectangle that we can imagine on this slice of table here. Troops deploy from it rather than in it. How far they deploy depends on what sort of troops they are. So let's have a look at the Romans first and then we'll repeat the whole thing for their hairy chums. These Roman warriors can deploy 6 inches from their deployment zone. So the deployment zone goes 6 inches in and they can deploy a further 6 inches from that. So let's put them down there. Now that's a maximum of 6 inches for all of those figures or either of those groups from the deployment zone, and all of those figures must be within that distance. It's not good enough to just have most of them or one of them or some of them. All of them must be within that distance. You can deploy in any order or formation you want, especially if you're Roman, when you could be in close order or open order. You literally just turn up. So any random events for moving are ignored in this situation, and you can do anything that you can do if you are not moving. Allied warriors, and maybe the Romans might have some of them, can deploy a bit further. They can deploy 9 inches from that. So here we're going to see that we're going to give them 6 inches the edge of their deployment zone, and then they can go 9 inches. Now that allows them to go an additional 3 inches out. As they're effectively barbarians, they can now raise further as long as they've got a leader with them who can use 2 command initiatives to do so. The important thing to remember again is that they aren't moving when they deploy, on the principle that they may already have been there in the mists, and as those clear their opponent can see them there. Now we'll have a look at further specifically when we see the barbarians deploy, because I think it's probably wise to look at the whole issue of further then. Cavalry can deploy further. They can deploy up to 12 inches from the deployment zone. Skirmish cavalry can go 15. So we can see incrementally the faster the troops, the further they're going to be deploying from it, but it isn't movement. Okay, next we have ambush points. Now if we look here we can see a Roman ambush point in the woods. Troops deploy from an ambush point in exactly the same way, but they measure from the ambush point rather than from the deployment zone. You can use these to deploy normally or to ambush. Now, as I said, we're going to look at ambushes when we look at the barbarians. For now, it's important to say that not all Roman troops can use ambush points. The legion, like these Caesarian Romans here, can never use it. But if we zoom forward another 100 years, These auxilia are a different beast as they have flexible drill. Now if they want to come on in close or open order, they must deploy from the deployment zone in the same way that the Legion do. But if they're skirmishing, they can use the ambush point, and we can see them deploying on there at a distance of 9 inches from there. So the forward placed ambush points will allow lighter troops to rush forward towards the enemy. Now they have a couple of options here because they've got something called flexible drill. It means they can ambush the enemy, which means they can come straight out of those woods and go straight into contact if they're using 2 Signet cards in order to do that. But if they do that, they will remain in their skirmish order, which means they're not fighting as warriors in an ordered formation, but nevertheless they do fight with the warriors' 8 dice. So it's a bit of a sacrifice of a couple of dice for being fighting in an orderly fashion, but it does allow them to make that ambush. Alternatively, they could simply deploy from that ambush point and then change into another order, such as open order or closed order. So whilst that's representing having moved through this denser terrain in skirmish order, as they are able to do, they can then come out and form up. So it does allow them to steal a bit of a march on the Legion. But remember, if you ambush with them, they must be in skirmish order. You can't change order during an ambush. Dedicated skirmish groups, such as these slingers here, cannot ambush because they can't make contact with an enemy. But they can use the ambush point to deploy from as normal. So, finally, we've got deployment points. Deployment points are effectively a downgraded ambush point, something that's been scouted by the enemy before the game commences. So it looks almost identical to this ambush point. As long as a troop type can deploy from an ambush point, they can use the deployment point to deploy. However, you can't ambush from a deployment point. In effect, the enemy have seen it, they know about it, they're expecting you, their scouts have done the job and tip them off. So let's have a look at the barbarians now. Well, their deployment points are very similar. They simply tend to get a better deployment range than the Romans. As we saw with the Romans' tribal allies, the barbarian warriors can deploy 9 inches rather than 6 inches that the Roman legionary warrior or auxiliary in close or open formation can. But fundamentally their options are the same. Any troops can deploy from their deployment zone. However, any of their troops can deploy from the ambush point or deployment point. They have no categories of troops like the Legion that are limited in doing that. Again, deployment doesn't count as moving, as we saw with the Romans, so the barbarians deploying can immediately do things like raise fervour, something that the Romans can't do. Now, you roll the dice. Let's bring on a couple of our barbarian groups so we can see that happening here. We'll get rid of our Roman friends there and grab these tribal warriors have suddenly changed sides. So here we have a mob under let's say he's a level 2 leader because that's all he needs to be in this situation. So he can deploy and we can roll a d6 to see what level of fervour they arrive at. Now remember, it's one roll for the mob, not per group. So we've rolled a 4, and that means that each of those groups gets 2 points of fervour. So, as I say, they're not moving, they can do that immediately, and it's very important for the barbarians, if they're deploying onto the table rather than ambushing, to start raising their fervour as rapidly as they can, certainly if the enemy are close by. There are some other things that we can do when we're deploying. We'll have a look at them in a short while, but let's look in detail at how an ambush works. And in fact, we'll take those further off and we'll use these groups here as an example. And we put some Romans out here, and we're going to place a couple of ambush points on the table so we can see how they work. There's one in high terrain in a wood, and there's one in low terrain on a hill. Now, the important thing to remember about placing ambush points is that if you're placing it in low terrain, now that might be a hill or it might be a marsh, You can only normally ambush out of there with one group. When you place an ambush point on a hill, don't put it behind it because that's not on the terrain, please. Put it on the hill, because the presumption is hills are made up of folds in the ground and small gullies and things like that where men can hide. But the numbers, of course, are going to be limited because it's low terrain. When it's high terrain, any number of troops can ambush out of there. To conduct an ambush, the groups involved must be able to trace a straight line from the ambush point to the target. So in this situation here, we can see that that's very, very simple indeed. However, if we had a group of slingers in between who had earlier deployed from that point, then you couldn't ambush through them to it because the path is blocked. It has to be a completely clear path. Likewise, if the enemy had some of their slingers covering that wood, being aware that the enemy could be potentially deploying from there, any ambush would have to hit the slingers rather than the legionaries. You cannot jump over intervening units. An ambush has a fixed distance of 12 inches, whatever type of troops are involved. For the Romans and the cavalry, that's fixed. If the Romans were ambushing from there, let us assume it was a Roman civil war, those guys are 12 inches away, so they can make contact with them. If they were any further away, they couldn't, and so they couldn't launch an ambush. There is no point in launching an ambush at something that you cannot hit. You have to potentially be in a position to hit it. For the barbarians, and any barbarian allies of Rome as well, there is the benefit of fervour. Now, clearly a mob deploying won't have had the chance to raise fervour as we saw these groups here do, this mob here do. So we now make that roll once they've declared their ambush, just the same as when we raise fervour. This is a single roll that covers all of the groups in that mob, but it's slightly enhanced to represent the fact they've been lurking in those woods, getting all psyched up as they see the enemy coming. So we roll a dice. We've rolled a 5 here, which means they will have 4 points of fervour each. On a 1, 2 or 3, they'll gain 3 points of fervour. On a 4 or 5, they gain 4, and on a 6 they gain 5. Just remember though that the peasant levy, which has a maximum of 3 fervour, will simply deploy at 3 fervour. They can't roll less than 3, but they can't get over. So these guys, we know, can definitely deploy from there in an ambush. So let's have a look at how that works. We'll move them over there. Now let us, for the sake of this experiment, move these Romans a little bit further away. So they're outside 12. Which, if they were Romans ambushing Romans, they wouldn't be able to get there. It's outside their 12 inches. However, these guys are barbarians, and as we know, we've rolled a dice, which means they've got 4 points of fervour each. So we'll put our little micro dice on there showing that 4. We'll just do it on one group for the sake of this, because we're not going to be looking at combat in this programme. But for each point of fervour expended, they can add 2 inches of movement. So let's have a look there, and those Romans are 14 inches away. So what they could do is move into contact by expending 1 point of fervour from each group. So those groups would both reduce their level of fervour down to 3. A mob, as we know, has got to move straight in a direct line towards the enemy. They can't do a dog's leg, so they couldn't say it's 12 inches out there and then I'm going to turn right and move in 6 inches there, because that is called cheating. There's no straight line involved. Okay, so just think about this. They have a basic 12-inch ambush range, and they have a potential to roll 5 points of fervour, which could be an additional 10 inches. So the maximum range they can declare an ambush from is going to be 22 inches, because anything more than that they simply wouldn't be able to get there, unless it was, of course, a group of fanatics who could be ambushing at 24 inches because they have 6 points of automatic fervour. Now ideally what you don't want to be doing is ambushing at extreme ranges, because fervour is what gives your troops an edge. However, within the rules, you can do it if you want. To To ambush an enemy in the rear or the flank, the ambush point must be in that opponent's flank or rear zone. You cannot ambush out and then again create that dog's leg which allows you to get on the flank. If the ambush point is in the enemy's rear or flank zone, then the ambush is made on the flank or rear, otherwise it's not. Okay, now in addition to the plain and simple ambush, the barbarians have another option up their sleeve which I've already alluded to, and this is in the form of fanatics. Fanatics can deploy from any deployment zone, any ambush or deployment point. They'll usually have a supernumerum leader with them and deploy on that card. However, the player may choose to deploy directly out of any mob of 2 groups or more, so any mob effectively, because a mob must be 2 groups, and they use that mob as an ambush point. They'll do that when the leader commanding the mob uses a command initiative to do that. They won't do it on the supernumerum card in that situation because the mob leader outranks the supernumerum, and therefore, as they're part of that mob, even though they aren't necessarily on the table, because effectively the enemy can't see these guys, they are really just some of the biggest lunatics in the village who are prepared to rush out and try and break the line at the critical moment. So we don't deploy them onto the table until they deploy. So they are considered to be part of that mob and therefore under control of that named leader rather than the supernumerum. Now you can ambush immediately when the mob deploys onto the table, and that could give you a huge reach. You've already deploying a mob 9 inches onto the table, and then because these are fanatical warriors, they can ambush 12 inches, and as we know they've got a guaranteed 6 points of shot, and they can add another 12 inches to that. So they could be heading over the table 33 inches, and if you include the 6 inches for the deployment zone, you know, they're heading out there 39 inches. Which is a long way across the table. That said, it's potentially a waste of a good unit. Burning off some further to add to movement is fine. Burning off the lot takes the edge off the troops and reduces their effectiveness hugely. A better trick, and this is tactical advice rather than a rules issue, is to wait until the enemy are close, rather like we've got this this mob here. Wait till the mob, the Roman legionaries, come close, and then ambush out with the fanatical warriors on this leader's first command initiative when he is activated. That will allow these barbarians to go screaming into the front of the Roman unit, not burning any further. They get a big benefit for the first round of combat only, which, again, looking at tactical tips, is a great reason not to waste them on clearing out skirmishers, because their big punch is their first one. And to do that to get rid of skirmishers is, well, in some situations I guess it can be tactically appropriate. In many situations it can be attractive but inappropriate. You have to decide on that yourself. However, so go in there for this leader's first tactical initiative. They will then fight their 2 rounds of combat, and bear in mind that they keep fighting until all of their fur is gone, and then until shock doubles their number. So they're going to be fighting in there, and then once they've finished their 2 rounds of combat, send in for this leader's second command initiative the mob. Now if these guys have been wiped out, that will mean the Romans have probably suffered somewhat and be out of balance, and maybe with more shock on one group than the other, more losses on one group than the other. And that's the perfect time because you'll be hitting a disordered enemy. If the fanatics are still fighting, then you'll be joining the fight and reinforcing the fight and starting it again immediately. Either way, this tactic's going to be putting a lot of pressure on the Romans. So there we go, that's your Free and Grass's top tactical tip for the programme. But that's an ambush. So we can see we've got 2 types, we've got the normal type and we've got the fanatics type. That's the ambush. What else can you do on deployment? Well, you can throw missiles. This is obviously good for slingers and archers, but warriors can do it as well if you deploy and the enemy is within range. Remember, barbarians or skirmishers will throw missiles for free, almost, if you want a better term, at any point when they're activated. When they're activated, they can move and use missiles. There's no need to do anything additional. We don't break this down into separate actions. It's just you're activated, so you can move and shoot. Roman warriors throw missiles when a command initiative or signa card is used. That's part of their drill system. The drill system is a big advantage to the Romans, but it does mean in some situations they're not quite as flexible as the barbarians. Cannot throw missiles when you're ambushing like our frothers here. An ambush represents a full-on charge at the enemy. It doesn't represent hanging around to throw missiles at them. Now, it doesn't say that in the rules because I didn't even think anybody would consider it. But your inventiveness constantly surprises me, and so that will need to be added to an errata when we produce one. Now, on that point, I'd like to use this series of programs to generate any questions that you may have so that we can include them in an FAQ. Obviously, watch this program first of all and see if we're answering your questions on deployment. If we're not, if you've got any issues about deployment, please put them in the notes and comments underneath, and we'll be having a look at them, and then we can include them. Well, I'll try and respond below, but we can include them in an FAQ. Don't watch this program on deployment and say how does shooting works. Save that for the shooting one, or put those questions on Facebook or Twitter or the Too Fat Lardis forum, and we'll try to answer them there independently. But be aware that these videos are going to be coming out in pretty quick succession, so they are cheap and cheerful and grubby and grotty, but they do, we hope, do the job in terms of focusing on the key points and explaining the key points. But obviously there is always going to be a learning curve, and especially in a game which, you know, let's not make any bones about it, has got lots of nuances to it, which is, we hope, part of the attraction of the rules. Remember, I'm always happy to discuss not just what the rules are, but the reason behind those being the rules, the design decisions made. So feel free to ask those questions as well. Some of them may not get into an FAQ because they're more ethereal, historical gobbledygook, but nevertheless, put it in there and we can always talk about it and see what we think. So that's the drill. Hopefully that has given you an indication into what you can do when deploying. One thing I have forgotten to cover is chariots, but we will look at that in another program when we're talking about movement, and I think it would be better to cover that actually in movement, because we've got the issue about how chariots move and then you deploy into an attack, and I think that's something that's very specific to chariots and would be better covered in the movement phase. So don't ask about that one yet. That's the next program that's going to be happening. There we go, that's it, that's all for this program. We hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it informative, and we obviously hope you're enjoying Infamy, and we hope this will help you enjoy it even more. So thanks for watching. Cheers.